On the northwest coast of England, on Crosby Beach, there is an art installation by Anthony Gormley called Another Place. There are 100 cast iron life-size figures spread out along 2 miles of coast, and they stretch out to over half a mile out to sea. They all face one way. They all face the horizon. When you visit Crosby Beach, although it is by no means isolated from the world, it's very close to houses and other buildings, you feel like you are isolated. I went with a friend, yet I was still alone. And when we went, we wandered around the statues, imagining what the figures were looking at or waiting for or thinking about. And we stood beside them and we followed their eye line to what seemed like nothing, a beyond, another place. There they stand, socially distant from one another, alone and waiting. They absorb the ebb and flow of the tides. Some of them are sunk well into the sand. Some stand tall on a plinth. Some are covered with seaweed and with barnacles. Some have clothes on. A well-wisher, perhaps, standing beside them, worrying that they were cold with no clothes. Each figure is alone, yet amongst others like them. Each one looks towards another place. Each one standing in a place they don't want to be, longing for different, perhaps looking for something they've lost, or maybe a place they hope to be one day. For someone like me, the figures are intriguing. I want to know more. Today we're thinking about grief, and that image of figures standing apart, enduring the weather that comes, eyes on the horizon, is a really helpful image of grief, because grief is universal. If you are a human being, you have probably encountered grief. The events of the last year and a bit have meant so many more of us have come to face with grief. We all, at different times, have stood like the figures in another place, looking at the horizon, wondering how we get through this and make our way to a different place. Grief hits and it hurts. It has the potential to overwhelm us like the waves on the figures on the beach when the tide comes in. There are times when we think we're doing okay and we hold ourselves well above the sinking sand below. But sometimes we find ourselves stuck waiting, wondering how we might put one foot in front of the other and find our way through. There is so much to grieve right now. So many of us have lost loved ones and friends in the last year, and we haven't had time to say goodbye in normal ways. We've lost security and we've lost a sense of control. We've been isolated and cut off from familiar routines and community. We're missing being together and laughing together and worshipping together and everything that brings us purpose. The world has changed. It is temporary, but there will be ongoing changes. Just like other key events in history changed the world forever, this pandemic will do the same. As we search for the new regular, we mourn the loss of normal life and the loss of connection. We worry about the future because we're unsure what the future looks like. We might call that a kind of anticipatory grief. We don't know what's going to come. There's kind of a collective grief around. We stand together in that. But like the statues at another place, we also stand alone. We all deal with grief in different ways. We long for another place. We look to the horizon, but we don't know what lies beyond, and we don't know how we will get there. Our reading today, which you might want to pause and read now if you haven't read it already, sees Jesus walk right into the middle of a grieving family. His friend Lazarus died 4 days ago, and sisters Mary and Martha are mourning. Jesus tells Martha that in the end it will be okay. There is life eternal ahead. But then he encounters Mary, who is weeping, and the grief of the loss of his friend overwhelms him. And so we find the shortest verse in the Bible that says so much. Jesus wept. As we think about grief and finding peace in grief, we're going to sit there for a moment, at that moment where Jesus wept. If you know the story, we know that there is an amazing miracle coming, but right now, Jesus is weeping. In his commentary on John's Gospel, Tom Wright says this: "The Word, Jesus, through whom the worlds were made, weeps like a baby at the grave of his friend. Only when we stop and ponder this will we understand the full mystery of John's Gospel. Only when we put away our high and dry pictures of who God is and replace them with pictures in which the Word, who is God, can cry with the world's crying, will we discover what the word God really means." The Word, who is God, cries with the world's crying. As Jesus sees his friend Mary weeping, he can do nothing more right then but sit in that moment and weep with her. Whatever is coming, whatever has been, that moment of grief becomes his. And when we grieve, the world stops for a moment, for a time, and the mystery of life and death hangs in the air. We look out to the horizon, and while sitting in that moment, we weep for another place. When I read this story of Jesus, where his humanity flows out in tears, I imagine that he couldn't help himself. The tears just came. And tears often fall, despite us trying to resist them strongly, trying to hold it all together. I don't know about you, but I have cried more in the last year than I have done for a long time. The effects of the trauma of the pandemic on our lives, of the lives of those we know, and the lives of people across the world have been at times overwhelming. And Jesus wept. Now, in first century Palestine, funerals were very expressive. The burial of a loved one would often happen the day of death, which is absolutely necessary in a hot climate. And it would be followed by a funeral procession and 30 days of mourning, loud mourning and dramatic displays of grief. To cry with others would be normal. Jesus did what was normal. Yet the fact he wept is so very important to help us understand where we find peace when we're grieving. When we grieve with others, one person's grief communicates to another. The sadness of one person affects another, and grief is shared. Even if we haven't been personally affected as much as a neighbour by grief, we feel their grief. Jesus weeps when he sees Mary and others with her, the others with her in tears. He sits with those who are grieving and he weeps. The prophet Isaiah tells us that he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows in chapter 53, verse 4. Jesus doesn't just power on into the scene and go into the tomb straight away and bring resurrection. He pauses to hold the grief. He is not someone swooping in to save the day, but here right now he is a man of sorrows. He understands the pain and the grief. He shares it and he weeps. However you are feeling right now, Jesus shares that with you. He shares your grief with you and he bears it. When you think you may not be able to get through, he is there. Perhaps in Jesus' tears, you might find peace. If we know the story of Lazarus' death, we know that after that pause, where Jesus wept, a miracle happens. That while Jesus pauses and genuinely enters the pain of death, it is only a pause, as Jesus refuses to accept its finality. And it's important that we recognise that loss is never the end of the story. Jesus goes to the tomb, asks for the stone to be removed, and he raises Lazarus from the dead. In that moment, we see a glimpse of Easter. When we know of the resurrection, our grief becomes hopeful. We know that death, that loss, that emptiness is not the end. At the very centre of the Christian faith is death, but there is also resurrection. On the cross, Jesus enters into the grief and suffering of the world and experiences the abandonment and devastation of death. In the resurrection, Jesus breaks that power of death. It no longer lingers and restoration begins. As we sit grieving in all that the pandemic has taken from us, we must never lose sight of the cross and the empty tomb. The cross reminds us that Jesus weeps, but the resurrection reminds us that there is hope. As we pause for weeping, we feel the closeness of Jesus in grief. In that pause, we see Jesus acknowledge the grief. And the first step in finding peace in grief is acknowledging that it's there and what it is doing to us. Grief comes in loads of ways. It makes us uncomfortable, it makes us squirm, but it's here. Have hope in grief, but pause for a while and know that grief is here. It's not until we acknowledge grief that we can walk on the path of healing. It's not until we invite Jesus into our grief that we can see the way along that path. When Jesus asks Mary and the others with her where Lazarus is, they tell him to come and see. It's a call that's heard throughout John's Gospel, from the calling of the disciples to the call to come and have breakfast on the beach after the resurrection. And it's a simple invitation, but it goes to the heart of the Christian faith. In your grief, say to Jesus, "Come and see," and take him with you to that place of deepest, darkest sorrow. And there, for a while, he will sit with you. But when the time is right, turn your face to him. As you turn your face, he says, "Come and see," and will lead you through the sorrow to the place where he now dwells in light and love and resurrection glory. That is another place. That is a place of peace. Those figures looking out to sea, they're all looking for something different on the horizon. But the things they are looking to find are different to the figure next to them. They're all looking for a way ahead, and although it seems that their eyes are pointing in the same direction, what they are hoping for is different. And that is the same with grief. We won't all find peace in the same way. We won't all find peace in the same things. It might be that your peace will be found in finally being able to talk about what or who you've lost. It might be that your peace might be found in doing something to say goodbye. It might be that your peace will be found in acceptance. It might be that your peace will be found as you discover new things of life that won't replace what you've lost, but that will give you new hope for the future. It might be that your peace just slowly fills you until one day you realise that you're not looking for another place anymore, because now is okay. Loss is always loss, however far we've moved, and it will affect us for the rest of our lives. But as time goes by, it does get easier, and life becomes more livable again. As you seek peace in your grief, reach out to the one who leads you to that place of peace. Reach out to Jesus, who reaches out to you and doesn't leave you to face your sorrow alone. Amen.